Double sleeving your Magic the Gathering and other trading cards might be thought of as excessive by some, but if you are playing with a deck filled with playsets of $20 and even $40 cards, double sleeving can really be worth the extra 4 cents on sleeves. Double sleeving is actually quite simple. You'll need a pack of KMC Perfect Fits and a pack of KMC card sleeves. Dragon Shield sleeves can also be used, but they are a little trickier to double sleeve than KMC sleeves and are more likely to have air bubbles. I'll talk a little bit more about double sleeving with Dragon Shield sleeves in a moment, but first, here's the basics of double sleeving. Take a perfect fit sleeve and sleeve your card so that the opening is on the bottom. Then,
you gotta give him that huck too and spit on that thing, you get me?
Then, slide the perfect fit sleeved card into the regular KMC sleeve so that the opening is on the top.
Alright, ready to go?
Let's do it.
Great. In that case, we are now, right now, as we speak, recording another episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I am here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony. Wait, let me get the exact wording. Knows how to read Maddox.
Glad you took the time to look that up.
Well, I had to get the wording exactly right because it was so plain. I couldn't mess it up. I had to get it. I had to nail it. Some stranger just dragged you from a pod over when you showed off that you could read a Magic card. Real braggart.
It was actually funny because I struggled to read a lot of Magic cards last weekend. They're just a lot of words on these cards these days.
Did you actually struggle though?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
What was this one? It was like Karavek the Merciless, and I think I read it 4 times and did it wrong. My opponent's like, that's not what that card does. And I was like, thank you. Let's collaborate on trying to play this card correctly.
As we mentioned so often, I feel like it's a case of expectations. And I went in with the expectation of like, I'm going to just go full random on these cubes. Mm-hmm. I'm not going to make any selections. And I did, in fact, queue into a bunch of cubes that had a ton of supplemental set commander cards that I had never read before. My expectation was, this is going to be hard. It's going to be a lot of words. It's going to be a lot of reading. I got to make sure I don't mess up. And it didn't feel as bad, I think, as I had expected it to be awful. It felt manageable for me. Now, I misplayed it a bunch of other ways. I planted in just much more obvious ways that didn't have to do with not reading supplemental set cards, but yeah.
Yeah, me too. I just, somebody had Skrelv, and I forgot that Skrelv, you can tap for Phyrexian mana or whatever to give something protection. I just tried to destroy something else.
That is the one thing about Skrelv, to be fair.
I wasn't paying attention.
That's like saying, they have Mother of Runes, a simple 1/1. It's
exactly,
fine.
Yeah.
An eager cadet over there. Anthony, this is our book review episode. Our book club episode, finally, which, how long ago did we announce this? I feel like, if you told me it was 4 months ago, I would have to believe you, but I don't think it was quite that long ago. We are doing our book club review of The Beauty of Games. If you are a regular listener, you will have heard us talk about this book by Frank Lantz, really up to this episode. If you are new or this is your first time hearing about this, it's fine. You're not going to have read the book in order to get some benefit out of this conversation as we have planned it, but that is the purpose of this episode, to discuss The Beauty of Games, and we need somebody else here to help us, Anthony, because 2 people does not a club make. We need a third, so we're joined, of course, by straight cis Baneslayer, Parker Lamascus.
Yes, I am the nemesis of gay trans Muldrifter.
Not the nemesis of, just the foil
to,
you know? Yeah,
yes.
the compliment to.
And I also know how to read, just so you know.
Trust me, I know.
Okay.
I got to give a shout out to Greg for that sweet nickname. I don't know how it even came up last night, but we were talking about the excellent handle, gay trans Muldrifter, and I just heard Greg say, straight cis Baneslayer? And I was like, yes, that is a thing. That is something.
It is now.
All right, what is it? You're a member of an actual...
I do want to also just thank Justin Jaffe on Twitter, who recommended this book and sort of inspired indirectly this series. Hopefully it'll be a series if this is a fun episode. What was your question?
I was going to ask what a book club is.
Oh, okay. So a book club
what do we do here?
is when a bunch of moms get together and have wine spritzers and there's a book around.
You just had to gender it, didn't you? Everybody can do a book club, Anthony.
Yeah.
I mean, men don't. Let's be real. Men don't read.
No,
It's true. I am the only man at this book club that I've been going to.
Are you really?
Yes.
I thought you were going to say you were the only man at
this
book club who can read.
It's just you, women, and illiterate men. This book club.
Andy, 90% illiterate man.
Yeah, I mean, I have a lot of notes, as you can see from all these little sticky notes.
You can read.
You have notes, so tell us what you thought about this book. Go.
Well, is that what we're doing here? Because I have a couple of things. I have thoughts on the book, like book review style, which are like some critical, some non-critical thoughts about the subject matter and whatnot. I have things about this book that I think we could tie back to Magic, maybe cube design, and use as like a sort of just jumping off point to discuss the subject we usually talk about on this show. And I also think we could just use this as a like very abstract way to start a conversation that maybe is inspired by the book, but maybe isn't, from some other open questions that I have.
I think we should do that one. And I think first, somebody should just give a little introduction to the subject of the book.
That sounds good. I can start with that. So, okay, if you haven't read it, that's fine, because I'm going to summarize it right now.
It's fine, and you're probably a man.
So this is, yes, this is The Beauty of Games by Frank Lantz.
Frank Lantz.
By Frank Lantz. And if I had to summarize it in 3 points, it's much more complex than that. But in 3 points, I would say, point 1, games are an aesthetic form. If you want to call that art, fine. If you want to call it like a cultural object, whatever word you choose. But games are an aesthetic form. Point 2, games combine rules-based systems with more subjective questions of meaning and purpose and beauty. And that's probably the biggest argument in the book, is like he's building up this case. And then point 3 is kind of the conclusion, which is the beauty of games, where the title comes from, is a movement.
I just pictured the Leonardo DiCaprio meme. As soon as I read the title of a book in a book, I'm just like, there it is.
There you go. The beauty of games is a movement through this systems thinking that's rules-based and very objective and like truth-focused in a physics-based kind of way. A movement through systems thinking to a holistic and healthy recognition of the flaws of that systems thinking. That's how I would maybe summarize it. Of course, I didn't really define those terms, so maybe we should like use that to discuss these 3 points.
Why don't I also then I'll give my summary as a foil to yours, which I think will also spoil some things I think about this book. I would say 30% of this book, maybe 35%, is beautiful, florid descriptions of how deep and meaningful individual games are to this person. Serpentes, poker, Go, other games.
Quick, name a game.
I did not expect Quap to pop up. I definitely did a little cheer when
Quap
popped up.
As soon as Quap
just a lot of descriptions of like this man's deep relationship with these games and how meaningful he finds them to be in his personal life. But I found that to be a little bit repetitive. It's like, all right, man, we get it. You like games. They mean a lot to you. It lets you see your brain. Then I would say it's another 30 to 40% defining of terms and like kind of defending this position that games matter and are important and should be considered important cultural media objects that are worthy of criticism and dedicated thought. And then it's 10% maybe poker, averted nuclear war. And that's where I get lost a little bit in the sauce, Mr. Frank, personally.
Yeah, we can talk about that.
The end of the book is very lofty in terms of what games theoretically can do. I was definitely... A lot of my notes here at the end just say, I roll out of my head.
Yeah. I do think there's an overreach at that.
I don't know if I agree that there's an overreach. I mean, I feel like we can talk about sort of like poker and the way it influenced people, but I think that, especially talking about chess and its contributions to the development of computation, I think that is like an incredible and true connection. And
also poker in the history of computation.
Yeah. And the fact that, computation had a tremendous outcome on every war since it has existed. Yes. I don't think it's reasonable to say that's an overstatement.
But maybe we should back up just a little bit.
All right, sure.
Do you think our listeners are on board with the argument that games can be beautiful or an art form or aesthetic or whatever you want to call it?
I think mostly yes. This is where I felt this book got off to a weird foot. It felt like definitely the first whole chapter, and then I felt some other bits of other chapters felt like preemptively defensive of people that are presumably critical of what games are and can be. And it's like, this is a book called The Beauty of Games. Everyone that picked it up probably knows that games are beautiful and wants to like and cares about this art form. The people that are like games are just, wastes of time are not going to read the book The Beauty of Games. It felt weird to me to spend so much time in the trenches talking about the value of these things as cultural objects when it's like, yeah, I felt like it was not for me. I was like, I know all this. I have felt that games are really important to me for my entire life.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true, and I think that if you just like. I had to sort of appreciate that, like, yeah, this is coming from sort of this academic perspective that this has been an argument that he's been making throughout his whole career, probably, and has definitely faced a lot of
And he's in academia, high academia, where
Yeah.
I'm sure that it is probably looked down on compared to other types of study. So
Yeah.
I get his position, but also it's like, all right, I mean...
It's also a popular audience book. Like, it's not written for another technical audience in his field. It's like if you played his Lego.com Adobe Flash game JunkBot, and you're like...
Did you?
Yeah, it's awesome. It's so good. By the way, if any listeners know where I can find that in 2024, just let me know.
I bet you can find it. Good luck running it in any browser.
Yeah. Like, that kind of person who doesn't maybe think about games or, like, enjoys Mario or Magic or whatever, and is like, it's just entertainment. What is beautiful about it? Like...
Sure, and maybe that's the audience for the book. And if that's the case, then it's just largely not for me, which is why a lot of it just didn't... It felt very repetitive, and it did not resonate with me because I was like, yeah, games are good. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I did find the juxtaposition of coming from that defensive context, but also then doing a lot of name dropping was maybe a little bit dissonant because it's like, well, if you're talking to a non-expert audience, they're not going to know these names. But I mean, maybe I was just the target audience because I was like, oh my God, Pauline Oliveros, I haven't thought about her in forever.
I also was like, Ian Bogost, I haven't thought about him in forever. Like, I know a lot of these things, and also I played almost every game he referenced throughout the entire book, with a few exceptions, but... I've played a lot of games in my life, and I'm a big co-op stan. What can I say? So, yeah, it felt weird. I don't have like major criticisms of that, other than it was like, all right, this doesn't feel for me. Like, I don't feel like you're covering new ground that is interesting to me. I feel like you're trying to bring people that don't see the world this way up to my speed, which I wouldn't have thought was the audience for this book, but maybe I'm wrong about that.
I do notice, like, and maybe this is just because I wrote a somewhat controversial article, but I did get a lot of, like, I've seen gamers who say, it's just a game, go touch grass. Why are you thinking about this like it's something to be critiqued and thought about critically? Just let me enjoy my entertainment. And so I do think it, like...
People on Twitter that read the headline and nothing else.
Yeah, for sure. There's some of that. But, I don't know. When he said that an aesthetic form is the kind of experience that if you could skip it, you would not.
I like that description.
I thought that was really good and really convincing. Like, us Magic players, if you had the option at Steel City Cube to get a trophy pin and skip all the playing, you'd be like, no, I want to win this.
Yeah, I think that's fairly obvious about games. Like, people know that games are a thing you do in your leisure time, so you wouldn't skip the playing of a game. But I think it's a good way to connect it to other things that this broader definition of aesthetic might not feel appropriate for. I think people think aesthetics as like visual beauty, right? And that's a very shallow definition. His definition is much more, I think, deep and profound, and I totally agree with it, which is that it's like this, visceral, like experiential, it's like a thing you do for the sake of doing it, right? I mean, another description here is like, I thought of how Anthony gets very upset when he thinks about Soylent, and people that are like, why would you skip the process of eating? Like, that is the point of eating. It is not to simply put calories in your body to continue living your life. Like, eating is a beautiful thing unto itself. And to go a step further, I think you would argue that the cooking is a beautiful step you love. And if you could just snap your fingers and magic a beautiful meal in front of you, maybe every once in a while when you ran out of time, you might do that. But for the most part, you would still cook, because cooking is a beautiful aesthetic experience for you. And some people just don't see the world that way. And I thought that was a good definition of what aesthetic is. I mean, I think
it's really good.
Overly critical of this book. There's a lot of things I do really like, but I also think that here's my overall thought on this book. I think my two main criticisms are, and first of all, if you love this book, please don't take this, personally. This is just a different perspective on the book. And also, I realize that, like, there's a chance this makes its way back to Frank. Frank, if you're listening, the book is great.
Ever since Richard Garfield listened to a podcast,
once Richard Garfield listens to your podcast, you get a little. Here are my two major criticisms. One is that I think this has a big, like, law of the instrument energy, where Frank clearly thinks about games a lot, and as such, he's like, oh, everything is games. And it's like, you could cut the world up that way by any metric you wanted to, right? Like data analysts would look at this and say everything is data, and social scientists would look at this and say everything is like social systems. Like a lot of it is like presented as this like kind of seemingly objective defense of how games are at the root of like many deep and profound things, and it's like that is one of many ways you can look at things, and I do not think it is in any way more true that everything is games than to say everything is anything else, right? Like anybody that knows a lot about something can see it everywhere they look in the world. Right. And I didn't feel like this was self-aware of that. It felt like it didn't realize this is just one of many ways you can view the world. It felt like this is like the one way to do it.
He pretty explicitly says this is a grand theory that is sure to be flawed because it's going to oversimplify, and we're just trying it on for size in this book.
Yeah, but it didn't acknowledge like, and there are many other completely equal and equally relevant grand theories.
Yeah, but when you're defending your thesis, like you saying, "Oh, this thesis has huge limitations," isn't a great way to start defending it.
I'm not even saying it has limitations. Obviously, it has limitations. I'm just saying that I also felt there were a couple of like sentences like that that I felt like were just kind of felt like they were plopped in there to like forego this criticism when actually every other sentence...
and it's not working. You're still doing it.
It's not, because every other sentence was written as if that thing you just said was not true. Like, you're like, oh, this just has flaws. Let me go on and talk about how it has no flaws now. But that's how it felt to me. The other thing I thought it was extremely... Like, this man has a beautiful mind. I believe that, truly. Like, I think the way he thinks about the world is beautiful. I learned a lot from seeing the world through his eyes. But I also think that he sees all this beauty in these individual games, and I think he doesn't acknowledge that lots of people might play those games and not have that experience at all. And I think QWOP is a silly thing that's funny to laugh at. And I do not, as much as I love QWOP, think that his really deep defense of how like it gives you, a perspective into the mechanics of your brain and how you learn the unlearned and like all this stuff. Like, I could not stop rolling my eyes at the description of how QWOP was this like deep and profound thing. It's like, sometimes things can just be fun. Like, I think QWOP can just be a fun, silly game. And I think at some point when you are seeing more meaning in these things than the people that made them and the people that are playing them, the vast, vast majority of the people that are playing them, I think you're just kind of lost in your own sauce.
Okay, wait. Well, let me take a step back on a couple of those points. I think that something that I found very compelling is he really broke down in a very lucid way that games are an aesthetic experience and the media itself of it is like thought and systems, right. Which, he compared it to visual perception is a thing we do, and because we have it, we're going to make it joyful and have a beautiful aesthetic experience and invent paintings and sculpture.
Right.
And language is a thing that we have that serves this very practical purpose, but humans are inevitably going to make beautiful things and write novels and poetry and like have things that are valid just because the experience itself is valuable, not because it serves some concrete purpose. And games, they have this aesthetic component as well. They are visual. They have imagery associated with them often, but the fundamental thing that is the game is the system. And the fact that we have a lot of systems for doing practical things and solving problems and thinking about how do we build planes and agriculture, but we also have this aesthetic experience of systems and create systems that serve no direct purpose but are just beautiful to experience. That I found very compelling and lucid. What was the other thing you said? So like I totally buy that, and I think that your point about, not everything is games, I think that his perspective that we can think of everything through this framework of games is very powerful, because systems thinking and, both understanding physical natural systems that already exist in the world and the systems that we create as people, it's kind of just the aesthetic interpretation of that kind of thinking, which underpins so much of human experience and so much of human effort.
Maybe a big part of this is that I kind of come at this from the other angle. To me, everything is systems. That is like that's my little kernel that I look at the whole world with. And so I just see games as one of the many systems. And for him, he's like, well, everything is games. And therefore, every system is a game, because that's how it's just this like subtle difference in how you perceive things. But that led me to read so many of the passages in here and just be like, I mean, he even says, there's also like some kind of contradictory stuff in here. Because he even says early on in chapter 1, something to the effect of like, some games are really deep and meaningful, and some games are just like fun candy, and that's fine. They have the full range of like experiences, and then goes on to describe how QWOP is one of the deep and meaningful games. It's like, that's one of the candy games.
And I think that people do have that powerful experience of being like,
say what QWOP is?
Frustrated.
Do people know QWOP?
Just visit QWOP right now and play it.
QWOP. It is a game that allows you to control the 4 joints on the human leg with 4 buttons, and you just try and walk, I think, 100 meters as fast as you can. And the joke is that most people can't even walk at all.
I went negative meters, yeah.
The control system is very backwards, or it's very unintuitive. And I think that people are having a beautiful experience when they're sitting down and they're frustrated and they're like, why does this game not behave the way that it expected? And I have to like try and like shape my brain to think about things in a different way. I think that people can have a beautiful and important experience even if they are not thinking they are. Like, I think people could just be like, oh, this is fun and silly. And I think it's totally reasonable for us to say there's something really powerful about that fun, silly experience you just had.
And like, I think a lot of that is in the attitude of the person engaging, the attitude of the player. I don't really expect that every person who walks past a certain painting or whatever has the same depth of engagement with that piece of art.
Oh, definitely not.
Like, or like...
But to be fair, I would also be rolling my eyes about a book that was describing the importance of paintings this highly, because I do not think they are that important.
I think that matters because there is a perception of games as like, this is an entertainment industry, like video games make a lot of money. They also teach our kids to be violent sociopaths or whatever because they spend all their time shooting Call of Duty people or something.
Pretty
Get
sure
out of
that's
here,
how that game
Call
works.
of Duty people.
I mean, the valid critique being that like the CIA has had input on the Call of Duty games or whatever.
The military industrial complex has straight up funded lots of war games. So.
But even then, like video games especially have popularized the art form of game and like made them broadly available in a way that they weren't necessarily before. And with that has come like, is this just a fad? Is this just a way to make money on the App Store? Or is there something more to it? And I don't think it's just a product. And I think that's why he's having to spend so much time arguing against it.
That was, I think, one of the parts of the book that, this is at the very end, where he's talking about how because of the ascendancy of video games, we have an ascendant new type of thinking that we are only going to start to see the ramifications of in, the future, basically. And he compares it to like the invention of literacy and how that changed how people thought. And I'm a huge linguistic relativity stan and like the believer in the profound effect that literacy has on the way people think. And what I don't understand there, maybe you can explain this to me, is that he describes games as like a relatively new thing, while also in the same book talking about how chess and Go have been around for thousands of years. If these games have been around for so long and they're so meaningful, why are we only now just going to be starting to see this entirely new way of thinking because of video games?
I think it's not that the games are new, it's that our perspective and our willingness to think about them is new because they are so much more present and visible.
Are they relatively more present and visible?
I'd say yes for a couple of reasons. One is that globalization has driven kind of systems that operate at a global scale and has driven systemic problems that are global in scope. And that makes the systems thinking of games kind of uniquely more relevant than it used to be.
This is where I just work backwards. I'm like to me, yes, we are in a hugely meaningful time of like big picture transition in the arc of all of humanity. But to me, that's all about the Enlightenment, the Industrial Revolution, and like those things are the things that have caused systems thinking. The fact
that he discusses.
But then he's like, and that's all games. It's like, no, games are like video games are a byproduct of that. Like the fact that
I don't think he ever says it's all games.
Can you actually read, Andy? Is that? Yeah, I am impressed with how many Post-it notes you have in that book, though. That's Herculean number of Post-it notes.
Okay, here. Let me just.
Yeah.
I think by far the best passage in this book, without question, is in the printed book on pages 139 to 141, which is called Reasons for Doubt, where he goes through a couple of paragraphs that I agreed with more than anything in the whole book.
Okay, yes.
And it was basically him describing, like, here's my beautiful, thing I've described for the previous 138 pages. Mm-hmm. And here are all the reasons why maybe that's not true. And every single paragraph, I was like, yes, that is actually what it is. That is actually what it is. That is actually what it is. And it was talking about how, like, maybe actually this is just a huge industry that is just basically making slot machines to, like, get advantage of people's attention and energy to, like, make money and all this kind of crap. And I'm like, yes, that is what it is. Hello, Cube fam. Andy in the editing booth here. I'm just going to read this section for you, actually, so it's easier to follow if you're listening on the podcast, even though I didn't read it in our conversation with Parker and Anthony. Here we go. Reasons for doubt. It seems reasonable to stop at this point and wonder, is this true? All this talk about new forms of literacy and gamer intelligence, it sounds great, but is it happening? Can we see any evidence for it? It's easy for those of us in the world of games to see gamer intelligence in the flattering mirror of our self-reflection, but can we see it in the world at large? When you stand back and let the overall essence of gamer culture wash over you, do you see the positive features we were talking about? Fluid intelligence, sensitivity to the subtle operations of complex systems, awareness of surprising consequences and emergent effects? To be brutally honest, in its most prominent forms, gamer culture often seems to demonstrate exactly the opposite, a way of engaging with the world that is stridently anti-intellectual, stubbornly literal-minded, completely inflexible, combining extreme naivete with massive overconfidence and willfully deaf to the subtleties of systems thinking, even as it exhibits a highly effective practical mastery of actual, real-world networked systems. Beyond its status as an isolated and obsessive pop culture fandom, video games culture one foray into broader public discourse was the train wreck known as Gamergate, which started out as a largely incoherent mashup of naive consumer rights protest, anti-feminist reactionary politics, and general edgelord trolling, and evolved into an active front of the culture wars, becoming a recruiting ground for the alt-right and a blueprint for its toxic brand of aggressive activism. It's possible to see some traces of systems literacy in the organizational and operational tactics utilized during this sordid chapter of internet history. But no amount of optimistic squinting reveals any fluid intelligence, model-based reasoning, or system-sensitive creative problem-solving in its underlying social, cultural, and political positions. These were defined instead by emotional overreaction, simplistic explanations, conspiracy theories, and the impoverished, self-perpetuating worldview of dogmatic groupthink, qualities we now, sadly, recognize as characterizing online discourse in general, a world of memes instead of ideas, sadism instead of empathy, trolling instead of sincerity, and mob mentality instead of shared humanity. Games didn't cause this problem. This is a problem as old as civilization. This is the problem of civilization. But we may have to admit that games have a special relationship to this problem. What good is all this speculation about the potential civilizational benefits of games as an aesthetic form if this is the actual real-world result? If this is what gamer intelligence looks like, if this is what the ludic century looks like, then we're in big trouble. There's also reason to worry when confronted by the massive commercial success of a mobile games industry that closely resembles the vulgar, flashing, whirling, hypnagogic tumult of a casino floor, that the most advanced forms of system literacy in games are the ones being applied by product managers and marketing engineers to maximize engagement, and not the kind we would want players to develop for themselves. Then, he follows it up immediately, and this is to me a perfect summary of this whole book, with a passage about how his ability to think about games in a certain way allowed him to figure out for his own how knots form in things in your pocket. And his argument against all of these extremely rational, backed up by huge amounts, mountains of evidence of how these games are actually having various effects on on society and culture and media, is to him completely refuted by him being like, oh, but here's how knots form in your pocket. And so we can put aside all of that stuff and say, like, actually, this is my example of how my way of thinking is truly real, because I had this thought myself in my own brain sitting in my house about figuring out how my headphones get tangled in my pocket. And it's like, that's a perfect summary of this book. Here's all the mountains of evidence that I'm going to kind of like hand wave at and acknowledge, so you can't criticize the book because I didn't say it. And then I'm going to say, but knots form in your pocket, because if you think about every intersection of the things as a node in a system, and think about how a knot is a close in that system such that once it becomes tangled, it won't become untangled. If a certain amount of chaos, experiences the system, eventually it's going to reach a closed state, and that's how they always get turned into a knot. It's like, cool, that's a cool thought. Why do you have to take that thought and raise it up to be as important and big as all of these things you've just essentially refuted in the paragraphs prior?
Well, because he's an academic.
Yes.
I hate that.
I did think this chapter was very funny, where he's like, systems, this kinds of game thinking is going to lead to like a next level of enlightenment. But we haven't really seen that pan out. Actually, we have a bunch of really, really toxic,
and then he's like,
toxic
gamer
Call
knowledge.
of Duty guys.
Gamer knowledge is the cringiest thing I've ever heard in my entire life. And his examples about gamer knowledge have given us great things. Nate Silver. Nate Silver's a clown. If Nate Silver's the best thing gamer knowledge can give us, if that's the best example you have of gamer knowledge, then gamer knowledge sucks.
Okay.
And we should not be doing gamer knowledge.
Here's what we're going to do.
I
that
think
concludes the book review.
Here's what we're going to do. We're all going to go have another cup of coffee and relax.
So it's really good criticism, actually. Like, I think I'm on board with you. There is a tension there between saying this is important and then kind of trivializing it with the examples, but also making the examples reach too far. I really want to talk more about that, but what do you want to say, Anthony?
I mean, my big takeaway from that segment is just that I think any kind of experience, if you go into it 100% and make that your only thing, you're not going to take away something powerful from it. And I think there is this segment of our culture that is the gamer people that just do games. They just play Call of Duty, and that's their whole thing. And I don't think that's going to lead to a lot of like the kind of enlightened new level of thinking that you can get through games that Frank is talking about. But I do think when you approach games as one thing in a series of experiences, like Richard was talking about this when he was on the podcast, that you can't just do games. You have to do games and then also read books and go outside and explore nature, and then you learn how the system of the game also applies to other things, and you actually like use that knowledge. Whereas if you're just focusing on only one thing, you're not actually going to see what's valuable about it because you don't have any context for it.
And that's the thing, is to me, I think the vast, vast, vast majority of people's experience with games is they experience a game that was made to fill a hole in the market, to make money, to abuse the brain chemicals that games are able to engender, and their experience is extremely shallow and basically just sucking their attention away to compete against television and movies and TikTok or whatever. Mm-hmm. Like, fundamentally, I am such a deep believer in that 90% of everything is I think 90% of games are
We've updated that?
It's always been 90%.
It's always been 90.
Really?
Yeah. You've said different numbers in the past on the show, but Surgeon's Law is
What
always
an
been
optimist.
90.
What an optimist.
I thought we had at least 20% good stuff.
And so, like, I guess what it comes down to is, like, I ultimately, despite my vociferous criticism here, I ultimately, like, think this is a beautiful and valid perspective on the world, and where it really lost me was all of the reaching for how, like, maybe this will, like, and again, it's two examples for, like, gamer knowledge where Nate Silver and Mutually Assured Destruction. He was like, aren't we so glad we had Nate Silver and Mutually Assured Destruction? And we can talk a lot about the development of nuclear weapons, but I'm not ready to sit here and say that Mutually Assured Destruction was a great thing for us.
Linger more on the perverse incentive structures of capitalism.
No, I mean, he, like, just throws a little, like, crumb to that. He's like, oh, yeah, and also capitalism's a thing, but the beauty of games.
Yeah.
I don't know. It lost me a little bit. But I have some questions where I think we could have some very nice, fun, positive conversation. Because I really liked parts of this book. I really liked the analogy that Parker mentioned earlier. I really liked the comparison of when he was talking about trying to develop something creative through quantifiable, measured analytics, and he was saying it's like somebody going on a date and, like, you know, measuring the dilation in their date's eyes and, like, their blood pressure and, like, you know, trying to get all the metrics on the date to, like, figure out how well the date is going and, like, tune their behavior. And it's like, that's not what that's about. That's not how dating is. And that is absolutely how I feel about making art. And, like, big data people will do exactly that. They will try and reduce everything to these, like, stupid numbers. There were a lot of beautiful passages in this book that I did really love, so I don't want to sound like I'm being too critical, but the overall tone really lost me, personally.
Yeah. I think it gets really good in the last, like, after he finishes talking about Mutually Assured Destruction.
There's like 3 pages after that.
Right.
That's like the end of the book.
I know. The last 3 pages
That's when it really gets
so good.
Can we just do this? Here, if you like that section, I want you to explain this to me, just because I genuinely, I truly don't.
Okay.
Like, here is, I think this is 2 pages from the end of the book. Literally, the second to last page of the book, he arrives at what he describes as... Here, I'm just going to read this paragraph or two. And after tracing the long and complicated relationship that games have with reason and rationality, I want to propose my own specific version of the bold claim. A version I believe might be true, that I want to be true, that I want to convince you is true, because it is the kind of claim that is made true through shared belief. The defining beauty that games offer this century is a passage through instrumental reason to meta-rationality.
Okay. A passage...
Academic... What do those words mean? Explain. Okay. I read the whole book. Explain what those words mean to me.
I did also struggle with what those words mean.
It's so stupid!
Okay. A passage through instrumental reason to meta-rationality.
What is meta-rationality?
This is like his big conclusion. Like, and
therefore... just restating it.
One of my other notes here, which I think is also, I think, part of why the tone didn't strike me well, one of these notes, I think, just says, I feel like he's always trying to write mic drop sentences. Like, it feels like every sentence he's writing, or like every 10th sentence, is him trying to write a sentence that's like, boom, take that knowledge bomb. And this definitely strikes me as like here's a mic drop sentence, sit with that for a while. And I was like, this is you just lost so deep in your, like, masturbatory academic sauce. Like, this makes no sense to me, and I just read the whole book. How's it going to make sense to anybody else?
Let me cite a couple more passages from the book.
Please.
Okay. This is from page 157. A major challenge facing individuals and societies in the process of developing systems literacy is thinking with systems and through systems without getting swallowed up by them. Systems give us the rules, roles, and responsibilities that structure our lives, allowing us to coordinate our actions around shared projects and principles. But from the perspective of an individual human, systems are cold and unfeeling. In systems, relationships are subordinated to roles and projects, and behavior is constrained by arbitrary demands that are insensitive to emotional experience. I'm going to skip a little bit. Confronting these truths about the limitations of systems can be immensely disorienting. Experiencing the power of systems to organize our thoughts and actions leads naturally to a desire to find some ultimate system, some global principle that will justify and organize all our beliefs and behaviors. But such a desire must always remain unsatisfied. This is the limitation of what he calls instrumental reason. Instrumental reason is essentially, he's using this to describe decision-making, like active participation in decision-making. A game is just, as Sid Meier might say, a sequence of interesting decisions.
Which he points out, and I think is right. I think it's not a great definition.
It's not a great definition.
Because there are so many games that are just like experiential. Just like you're not necessarily making interesting decisions, you're just in this experience, and that's a powerful thing games can do that is not
right.
But is that even really a game?
It's not a Sid Meier style game. I think it's a game. I believe that games are powerful and great. I truly do.
Another definition of games comes from C.T. Wynn, a games philosopher, who says that games are a distillation of agency. So, like, decision making may be not just with your brain, but also with your reflexes and body. Sometimes, in the case of like a sport. Mm-hmm. So you can, like as a Magic player, you can place your decisions into a framework, into a system. Like I understand the concepts of tempo and card advantage and so on. This is hard to explain.
Yeah, I mean, I read a whole 160-page book about it, and I still think this like final mic drop. I'm like, dude, you lost me. You lost me so long ago.
So instrumental reason is his piece of jargon for that process of decision making,
right?
Essentially. Systemic, like engaging with a system as a decision maker.
Yes. That I'm on board with.
And if you really want to be like really dry and analytical about Magic, Magic is a system of resources and rules and agents. And your job as a Magic player is to optimize those inputs and outputs until you win.
Yeah.
And so that's instrumental reason. This is weirdly similar to the scientific method as it's practiced in American academia, which I know because I'm an academic scientist, as that might be news to our listeners.
It might be obvious.
Flex.
It might be obvious to me, but
Flex.
What I'm saying is that like every day at work, like my job is to optimize a system and think about the world as being fundamentally reducible to systems. And that is the instrumental rationality that he's describing. Like,
yeah.
The appeal of science is that people say, it's true. It is just provably true about the world. And I do believe a lot of that. And yet, science is responsible for a lot of really horrible things. And so his claim there in the last sentence of the book...
True too.
Yeah. His claim in the last sentence of the book is that games offer a passage through that over-reduction of reality into pure only systems to something called meta-rationality, which is the recognition that scientists need a moral code, for example. Like that's why it's resonated so much with me, is because like just going to work for 5 years has taught me this truth, or like taught me the truth in this claim that like it's not enough to just know the facts about the universe and have a system and like a thought model to describe it all. You also need things that cannot be proven or cannot be derived from that system. You need, okay, now we know how to make an atom experience fission. Should we do that? Or like, to whose benefit should we put fission to work? Should it be used for clean energy or should it be used for bombs? And that's something you cannot prove within the system. And so that is the beauty of games as he describes it. And then to bring it back to something that might be a little more common to our viewers, if you're thinking about Magic purely as inputs and outputs of rules and resources, then you're not thinking about what's the experience of my opponent. Are they having fun? Am I having fun? Is this helping me to be a more inclusive or a kinder person by playing this game? Or is it making me into the kind of person who's like, you know, a rules stickler or something like that? Are you following me that far?
What you're saying makes sense. I did not get any of that from this sentence.
Okay.
I did not, in his description of meta-rationality, see any sense of like moral code or ethics, or like, I didn't hear any of that in the book.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just a dumb guy. I mean, that's also fine.
I'm bringing to this a lot of background reading. Like
what you're saying is much more interesting to me, frankly, than a lot of the conclusions of the book. Because I thought he didn't talk about ethics and morality anywhere near as much as I felt was appropriate, given how lofty he was being with his reaches for what this type of thinking was capable of.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he didn't cover in his, like, isn't mutually assured destruction great? It kept us from blowing each other up so far. So, like, that I felt was a very kind of tone-deaf acknowledgement of the power of gamer knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's interesting and not surprising. I should have some more meta-rationality about this, that we're all reading very different things from the same book because we're coming to it from different contexts. And I mean, something that really influenced me is The Selfish Gene, which, you know, I know there's some not great stuff about maybe that work, or at least the author, but the chapter about, you know, how birds live in de-optimized systems where every individual is having much less access to the best resources because it is in each of their interests to, you know, nest earlier than they really should, because whichever one gets there first will get the prime nesting spot. And it's like, that kind of meta-rationality is what I get from it, where it's like, that's how the system works, and we need to be meta about it and think, actually, we don't need to just say, that's how the system works, so accept it. We can think, that's how the system works, so let's collaborate and decide to actually live in a society that organizes resources in a way that is actually better to the individual. But if we just do the first level of rationality, you end up with a lot of really horrible interpretations of how do we like justify suffering.
Right.
This touches on a thing which was something else that really irked me about the book. This is on page 135 of the printed book, and I think it's a little slightly different than your page numbers, Parker, because the thing you read earlier was actually one page later than the number you said, but close enough to the digital version. Here he quotes a book called Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows.
Mm-hmm.
And the quote is, "Hunger, poverty, environmental degradation, economic instability, unemployment, chronic disease, drug addiction, and war, for example, persist in spite of the analytical ability and technical brilliance that have been directed toward eradicating them. No one deliberately creates those problems. No one wants them to persist, but they persist nonetheless. That is because they are intrinsically systems problems, undesirable behaviors characteristic of the system structures that produce them. They will yield only as we reclaim our intuition, stop casting blame, see the system as the source of its own problems, and find courage and wisdom to restructure it." From the editing booth once more, though I'm really tempted to add a lot of additional thoughts here, because as I'm listening back to this conversation, there's so many more things I want to say. I'm going to refrain from doing that for the most part, because it was a conversation I had with Anthony and Parker. They don't have a chance to respond in the editing booth, obviously, so I don't want to abuse that privilege. I do want to say here that I'm going to talk about my problems with this quote right after this clip, but the most concise way to summarize my criticisms of this proposed approach is that it essentially is just a way to launder individual responsibility for those who benefit from broken systems through systems thinking. To say, no, actually don't blame the rich and powerful. They didn't create the system. They're just benefiting from it. We have to just stop focusing on blaming them and instead address the system itself. And as much as I am a dedicated systems thinker, I will not accept any argument that essentially amounts to laundering responsibility for exploiters and capitalists through systems thinking. And now you can hear me say that in a much less concise way. This kind of triggered me a little bit because it is so close to how I look about the world, because I'm such a huge, like, again, if you had to like describe what I think is the most important way I look at the world, it is systems thinking, right? And I feel like often in my life and in conversations with politics about people, like always coming back to just explaining the system and how it came to be. But the idea that we should not blame anybody in it and no one in it wants it to persist is absolutely asinine to me. There are absolutely people that want the system to persist, the people that continue to reap huge rewards and wealth from the existing system. And if we don't blame them because it's just a system, no one wants anyone to be hungry. It's like, no, but a bunch of people want to be rich and want to be exploitative and want to take advantage of everything at their disposal. And I think you have to have both. And this idea that like the system is this disconnected thing that no one's responsible for, I think is missing the point.
Well, yes and no. It is true that there are beneficiaries to this system, but systems are emergent. And in that sense, some of these emergent consequences of systems aren't designed in the same way that,
For sure.
when you put 100 ornithopters in a cube, you make one change to the resources available to the players, and then that leads to emergent behavior in how deck building and gameplay functions. You're not designing the way that I sequence my turn.
No, it's true. It's not like somebody sat down and designed capitalism to explicitly benefit the rich people, but to look at the systems we have now and not say that there are absolutely many entrenched, invested parties that want the system to remain exactly as it is or become more exploitative and more awful for their own personal benefit really lost me. My exact note here is, this. Very easy and appropriate to blame people who profit from the system. Anyway, I just wanted to tie that in because it was another thing. Can we talk about parts about this book I really like now? Is that okay?
Yes, by all means.
So, going back all the way to Chapter 1, Games as an Aesthetic Form, I really like the description in this book about how, again, comparing games to other art forms, like making a beautiful painting is essentially trying to, capture a beautiful moment, a beautiful visual, so that it is a repeatable experience people can have. And the same thing for music, capture a beautiful sound, it's a beautiful auditory experience, and make it repeatable so people can revisit that thing. And how games are essentially, there's actually another quote here from C.T. Wen, invoking the language of John Dewey, describes the fundamental quality of games in terms of crystallization. Quote, "Fiction is the crystallization of telling people about what happened. Visual arts are the crystallization of looking around and seeing. Music is the crystallization of listening. Games, I claim, are the crystallization of practicality. Aesthetic experiences of action are natural and occur outside of games all the time. Fixing a broken car engine, figuring out a math proof, managing a corporation, even getting into a bar fight, each can have its own particular interest and beauty. These include the satisfaction of finding an elegant solution to an administrative problem, of dodging perfectly around an unexpected obstacle. These experiences are wonderful, but in the wild, they are far too rare. Games can concentrate those experiences. When we design games, we can sculpt the shape of the activity to make beautiful action more likely. And games can intensify and refine those aesthetic qualities. Just as a painting can intensify and refine the aesthetic qualities we find in the natural sights and sounds of the world." I thought this was great.
It's beautiful, yeah.
For some reason, the thing that really struck me here is, dodging perfectly around an unexpected obstacle. I can feel in my body how satisfying that is.
Yeah.
And games really do allow that. And I can actually I can put myself directly in. I played a bunch of open world racing games when I was a kid. I loved driving around the streets of some city, and I would just drive around forever. And what was so satisfying about that was the moment of threading perfectly between two cars when you have no space on either side of you and you just get it right. That kind of satisfaction. I've actually described this to Hillary because I think my wife Hillary she would not describe herself as a gamer. I've been trying to get her more into games as an adult because I think they actually could provide a lot of value to her life. And one thing that I've seen her experience that is very visceral to me is the joy of spiking somebody in Super Smash Brothers. It feels good in your bones. It feels so good to do. All of the work that has gone into the animations, the interactions, that part of games is beautiful to me. And the question I have here for you all is, what are the experiences that Magic is trying to capture and crystallize and make repeatable?
So I just want to mention that comes from C.T. Wen's Games and the Art of Agency. It's actually a pretty great book if you want to hear more about that perspective. He's been interviewed on the Ezra Klein Show, which is a prominent podcast. You can find other interviews with him, and then also the abstract of that book is available for free on his website. So it's actually not the first time I've read that quote, but it's really good.
I mean, we've talked about previously why Magic is a difficult spectator game, just because so much of what is that kind of exciting moment is very subtle, and it's all about planning ahead for what is the probabilistic choice. Another part that really resonated with me was sort of the idea of thinking about poker in that probabilistic sense and thinking, 9 out of 10 times in this world, I would have been right. That's a kind of thinking that I've gotten in a really intuitive way from playing games. So that's something I really value from games. But it is really difficult to see that nuanced probabilistic type thinking when you're watching people play. It's not exciting in the same way. But
people don't watching poker because it's fun to watch people work through those probabilities. They watch poker because it's exciting to be that person just lost $50,000.
Yeah.
That's why poker is actually a moderately successful spectator sport.
But, I mean, as a player, navigating through those moments and just hitting that, I drew exactly what I needed and this was my out is so satisfying.
I made a list, and drawing your out you played
drawing
to
my out,
is one of the most satisfying things in Magic.
My opponent this week had a Footlight Fiend, and they had a combat trick I knew about that gave a creature Death Touch, and I just had to bite the bullet, attack, drew a card off of Military Intelligence, and I ripped that burn spell, and it was so good.
Nice.
Turn this like guaranteed 2-for-1 for my opponent into a 2-for-1 for myself. Oof.
That's so good.
I drew really lucky that game.
I mean, that's I think a big part of the like crystallized fun of Magic is that happens rarely. Even in Magic, which is a game that is I think designed, like this quote mentions, to make that happen more often. Like, how many times does that happen in life that you're like, I prepared for exactly this. I thought about this months ago, and now like it's coming to fruition that this thing I prepared for is like I've got exactly what I need.
Yeah,
you know, I think that's so rare to happen in real life, and you get that rush in Magic, which I think is one of the things that is really visceral and powerful about the game.
Another thing for me is getting a read on your opponent. Like, there's a time in Game 3 of a match with my friend Jack, I put him on the Wandering Emperor, which I'd seen in Game 1, and rather than use my vampire counter guy to make my Merit Lage token, I just attacked with the vampire guy, knowing that Wandering Emperor couldn't come in and kill my attacker without me getting Merit Lage in response.
Yeah, buddy.
And in that way, I just won the game over 10 turns.
And your brainstem was just tingling.
Yeah, it was so good. And it's what I live for in Magic.
Yeah, I had this recently. You know, I made some offhand comment early in the game. I was like, do I play around Censor here? And then I kind of did. And then on turn 12, they finally cycle Censor. And they're like, you've been playing around this whole goddamn game. How did you know?
Yeah.
Getting a signal in draft and being like, oh, that's gonna wheel, and then it does.
Getting your wheel is one of my things on my list.
The wheels.
It's so good.
I mean, but honestly, the reason that's so satisfying is because I think it is like validating a deep skill and knowledge, and it's like, wow, I'm good at this. Like the fact that I looked at this pack, and even though I think this is one of the better cards in the pack, I have read in previous packs that I don't think anyone's going to want this card. Drafting an open lane and wheeling your card is also deeply, deeply satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
I have a couple of other things I have here. I think just fundamentally picking cards in a draft is just a fundamentally basic, satisfying thing. It's like getting a present with every single pack. I mean, I was thinking about this actually last night. We were drafting. I drafted my second cube of the night, and I was was so excited. The person past me was going a little slow, and I was just like, I gotta give me the pack. Like, I wanted to see what cards. Like, my deck is coming together, and I desperately want to see what I'm gonna get to like augment it with, because that's just a fundamentally fun thing to like get a present. Basically, like that's a fun thing. I think curving out is deeply satisfying. Having like drafted a curve that allows you to go like 1, 2, 3 is like looking at that opening hand and knowing you're going to get to go boom, boom, boom. Very, very satisfying. I also kind of just think that we've said this before. I think it's true. Taking game actions is fundamentally fun, as is drawing cards.
Which I think really goes back to the aesthetic element. Like,
absolutely.
There's no reason that taking lots of game actions should be more fun if you're accomplishing the same thing in fewer game actions, but it is.
Yeah, and there's, in the same way that there's no reason why you should eat a nice meal when they're both the same caloric outcome, right? But it's aesthetically more fun to draw cards and take game actions.
Yeah.
In that same vein, I genuinely think shuffling is a fun aesthetic feeling. I think it's a big part of the reason why I like playing in paper. I do genuinely think that shuffling is fun, especially when you get good at it. For me, though, the biggest thing for all of this, the biggest thing Magic captures that...
Is it going to be winning when you're extremely disadvantaged?
No.
Okay.
It's just self-expression.
Sure.
Self-expression is the biggest thing for me in every game I've ever played. I have always loved games where I can customize my experience, my character. I spent so much time in Armored Core, just in the robot design garage, and like making different combinations of parts, and going to a little like pixel drawer and drawing my little emblems to like put on my robot. Like, self-expression is so deeply important to me in every game that I play. And Magic does this in very obvious ways, right? Like, I think a lot of people would say, oh, self-expression in Magic, like saying you're a, like, is it mage or whatever, which I would never say about myself, but that's a way that it is, like, kind of shallowly self-expressive.
I used to, yeah.
But
what changed?
Every single pick you make in a draft, every single decision in deck building is a expression of what you believe matters, what you believe is, like, valuable and important about the game. Obviously, that has naturally led me to cube design, which is the most, I think, self-expressive way to possibly play Magic, and the way where you can basically invite people into your world, and instead of just having your EDH deck that you have carefully crafted and every single card is like perfect for this like system, which is also beautiful. I also have a couple EDH decks still because I can't get rid of them because I have so much self-expression sunk into them. But Cube is the world where you can do that the most. And to me, that is the most beautiful thing about Magic, and the experience that it lets you express yourself in a way that I think is socially and otherwise just difficult in life sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Like that kind of expression in life often comes with having to spend money to buy things, because that's how capitalism works. Our only version of self-expression these days is,
And that doesn't count when you're talking about Magic the Gathering?
Look, we've talked plenty about that. We don't need to get more into Magic's complicated relationship with free market capitalism. But yeah, like, it's much easier and more aesthetically fun, I think, for me to build a cube, draft a deck, build a deck, play it, than to go make a painting. I do also make art. I do also, do other types of creative expression, but Magic is a way that, like, it just encapsulates that self-expression in a way that is very satisfying. And, like, it also encapsulates the self-expression in a way that that other people are at least speaking the same language as you. Like, I love having the conversation of, like, what do you cut from this deck? It's like, that's a fundamental question of values. That is not, like, just who's a better Magic player. The better Magic player is going to have the right answer. That is, like, a discussion about what matters in this environment. A discussion about what's kind of games you're most likely to have. And all those discussions, I think, are beautiful. And that's why Magic is so meaningful to me.
I think it's incredible that you came at this book critically, that it's a little bit too lofty and thinks, games are too important. And now you're talking about how making a cut from a deck that's like really sort of trivial offhand experience is fundamentally tied to your core values. And I don't disagree with you, but I feel like maybe there's a little bit of a narcissism of minor differences going on here.
It could totally be a narcissism of minor differences. Again, like, this book, part of why it rubbed me the wrong way in so many places was because I feel like I should love it. Like, I deeply believe a lot of the things this book presents, and then the way it presents them, I'm just like, no, what do you mean Nate Silver is the outcome of this? Like,
you just need some better examples for you.
Well, he could try and come up with some. He couldn't come up with some. He had these great paragraphs talking about all the, like, very reasonable criticisms of his ideas, and he's like, oh, but I figured out how knots can form in your pocket. It's like, okay, great, cool. I don't know.
All right, the other thing that I think is beautiful is winning from an extremely disadvantaged position. Winning on a mull to 5 is just incredible.
Oh my God.
Great
that
feeling.
Is really good. I had a match on Tuesday where I won on a mull to 5 on the draw in game 1 and then lost in game 2 and 3 with 7. I was like, oh, I guess
it happens.
I guess I'm better when
you're not distracted when you're not burdened by all those cards, or
fewer choices to make mistakes when you present me with less
or when
options
you beat
in my
an
hand.
Oko that's accelerated out on turn 2 and you fight through it. Yeah.
But the moment where you decide, actually, I don't need to care about this Planeswalker, I attack your face, and it's the right choice.
Yeah.
Or yesterday, I had a couple games where I just never drew my third land I didn't draw it for 2 or 3 turns, and it's like, I'm kind of going to lose this game, and then you still find a way to make it work. Those are really satisfying.
Drafting a new cube for its first time. And that's not because
its first time.
Yeah, like a cube's first outing. Mm-hmm. I love that so much because 8 players open up a pack, form, like, they might not be thinking about it consciously, but they are forming an evaluation of what the rules of the format are like. Is this a tempo forward format where card advantage is scarce and life totals really matter, like Bun Magic? Is it something where the micro synergies matter, like regular cube? Is it a combos forward cube or whatever? Each person is snap forming an impression of the format. They draft a deck based on this, you could think of it like a scientific theory about the physical rules of this format, and then the gameplay is a way of determining between 2 players who had the better theory. Like, who built a better deck?
Well, I mean, and also not even close to remotely determining that for sure. It's
right.
Like you're going to
get
some
uncertainty.
You're going to get one little tiny piece of data, and you may come out of that having lost, 0-2 decisively, and still being like, I actually still think I'm right, and you're wrong, and this just was not borne out by the randomness and the chaos in this system.
Yeah, I think that's so fun to participate in. I want to hit one more point.
Okay.
And this comes from actually the introduction of The Beauty of Games. He talks about how all games have a skill component and a knowledge component. So, as like, name a game. Mario Kart?
Name a game.
Yeah.
Any
game. Why is it so hard?
Let's say Mario Kart. There's a skill to Mario Kart, which is mostly dodging obstacles, like reflex time, etc.
Oh, you think that's the skill of Mario Kart?
You think that's what Mario Kart's about?
Someone just outed themselves as being Mario Kart, but go ahead.
What are you talking about?
Dodging obstacles. No, it's finding the perfect skip barber racing technique line, starting your drift at the exact moment.
Okay, so there's drifting.
Get the max. That is the whole game, Parker.
Okay, I know there's drifting too.
That's like saying the thing about Magic is not getting lightning bolted for lethal. You don't want to get lightning bolted for lethal, but the point is not dodging the wheel
to go straight down the middle of the track. Is that what you're doing over here?
You pedants! I can't put on a podcast
Smoke
with you
your
two.
ass in Mario Kart.
Okay, so the skill
Mario Kart. What are you doing this afternoon?
The skill is driving and drifting. But then there's also a knowledge of like, what is the range of outcomes of the loot box things, the question marks? Which question marks beat other question marks? Is it a better, if you drag a banana...
question marks beat other question marks?
Yeah, if you drag a banana behind you, will it stop a green shell? Will it stop a red shell?
That actually is really satisfying.
Yeah.
That's pretty important.
And that's not a skill, that's a knowledge. You have to memorize that information or learn it. Mm-hmm. There's also
I would say in competitive Mario Kart, the thing you actually have to know is like the lines through a specific track. If you wanted to,
there's also knowledge, like spatial knowledge of where are the shortcuts, where can you save a couple microseconds or whatever. Those things are kind of distinct. And his argument is that all games have some skill component and some knowledge component. And then he makes this offhanded claim that some games like Pokemon or Magic are extremely knowledge heavy, almost to an encyclopedic degree. And I've been letting that sit with me for 2 weeks now because it did occur to me, like, why do we as Cube designers and also Magic players put so much knowledge in between our players and engaging with the core skills of the game? Those things that we mentioned that Magic crystallizes, the feeling of winning from behind, reading your opponent, etc., etc. Why is there so much memorization in between starting a new cube and getting to that point?
It's a complicated game. I don't know. I mean, is that an unsatisfying answer? Just that the game is complicated, and I do think cube designers would be well served to ask themselves what are the experiences they're trying to crystallize, and can they do that in a way that requires less of this knowledge, which is what I think you're getting at. But I do actually think most cube designers, even ones that aren't maybe thinking in this way, are making micro decisions fundamentally with cards and saying, well, this one's actually more fun than the other one. And more fun on a sort of small scale might just mean that that individual card has more opportunities for those kinds of experiences and crystallized moments than the card they're cutting. This is if we give people the benefit of the doubt and assume they're not just power motivated, but I think we're well past that in the cube world, more broadly speaking. So I do think that people are kind of optimizing for that, and I think really they just lose a sense of what it means to not know this cube intimately and forget that players that have not drafted before are going to have a totally different experience and perspective on it than they do.
Because losing because you don't know how adventure works and it wasn't on the reminder text, losing because your cube is playing with damage on the stack and that's unintuitive and nobody knows how that works, losing because people don't know the range of combat tricks available in the cube. Those are knowledge-based losses, not necessarily skill.
Maybe. I will say that this reminds me a little bit of some follow-up to the follow-up to the follow-up that we talked about with Crimson Yoshi in the Discord this week, where we talked on last week's episode about Crimson's comments on our previous episode. This is all getting very meta. But I think what we kind of decided, or what maybe we kind of realized in that conversation, was that a lot of their complaints about what they perceived as like this invisible secret language of cards was actually just kind of like losing in a way they didn't expect all of a sudden. And actually, in a lot of those cases, it's not that if you had known that, you would have done anything differently, right? Like, okay, you know that Lash Knife Barrier and Pestilence is a thing. When does that come up in the draft that you are actually going to do something different because you know this is a thing, right?
No, but it changes what your probability model is, that like, yep, there's a game where that's going to happen.
It changes your expectations.
I'm going to lose that game, but now I still am playing to win most of the games that I will play because I'm expecting that that's going to be like a minimized section of the games. And if you don't expect it, that can be extremely frustrating.
Yeah, I do think it just comes down to expectations more than anything, though. Like, is this a cube where two cards can be combined in a way that could possibly just end the game? And are you prepared for that? By prepared, I don't mean like in the cards you drafted, just prepared emotionally for that experience. Mm-hmm. And we were talking more examples in the neoclassical cube of like similar interactions where like these two cards can just kind of like take things over. And they were like, well, yeah, I mean, people have to know how all the mind over matter loops work so they know how to like interrupt it. And I'm like, actually, no, you just have to know that disenchants are good. And that is true in so many ways for so many of these combos that you can just say at the beginning, hey, disenchants are main deckable here. And that is all you need to know as a player. And then when someone starts doing some degenerate thing, you can be like, oh, actually, I'll just stop that right now because Now I didn't know you could do that.
You
but now
say
that
you
I know
do that
you
forever?
can,
Okay, you don't.
I say you do it once.
I mean, it is kind of funny. Like, we were talking a lot about cards like Raga Draga that just sort of give you this set of instructions and here's how you build your deck. They pay you off for doing 3 different things that are kind of tied together in like a normal strategy you might otherwise do. And I think part of the argument was, you can draft that deck, you can pick up Raga Draga and do what it tells you to do, and then even when you don't draw Raga Draga, you're still
even when you don't Draga that Raga.
Even when you're not dragging that Raga, you're still then saying, well, I have a bunch of mana dorks and like big spells. That's still a strategy that works, and like the cards have kind of given you a hint to how it should work, which is probably true if you're giving this very explicit hint of draft disenchants. It doesn't really matter what you're going to use it for. You're going to figure it out when it comes up.
Yeah, and somebody 3-0'd this cube on the most recent Tuesday we drafted it, and they were like, hey, thanks for saying that Naturalize was good.
Thanks for cluing me into that.
I sure did main deck that, and it sure did save me a couple games. And I'm like, yeah, well, that's why I said it.
So I think, in other words, the challenge to myself that I've been pondering is, what does it look like for a cube to minimize the amount of knowledge necessary for players to start engaging with the fundamental skills of Magic? How can I decrease the lag time between somebody drafting my cube for the first time and that same person being able to bluff, being able to predict the opponent's hand, being able to engage in those crystallizations of the activities I find the most fun.
They got their wheel instead of not really know what's going on.
Right. Yeah. I don't think cube designers have, myself included, ever really thought about that seriously.
It is tough because broader meta answer to your question is like, well, don't draft cube. Like, that's really complicated. If you want people to have that experience more quickly, like, I think that's what my starter decks are largely trying to capture is how do I crystallize some of my favorite ways to play the game and some of my favorite types of interactions in just some decks that you don't have to draft, and there's we're breaking singletons, so there's fewer cards to learn. It's just that cube draft has fundamentally got such a high bar of you're going to look at 360 unique cards and you're going to make hundreds of decisions leading up to just even the first turn of the first game about your deck construction and your draft picks. There's just so much depth there that I think a lot of people, maybe reasonably so, are kind of just like, well, this is already a complicated way to play and it's not going to ever be super accessible, so why not just lean into that and kind of revel in it? Which, I mean, obviously we're huge advocates for keeping things simple and cutting out complexity when it's not really, really serving you. But I think that's probably where it comes from, is that it's still pretty far from the best way for people to have that experience starting from zero.
But I also think it's just because the legacy of Cube we've received from the designers of the format in the 90s was that Cube was a thing for the people with the biggest collections, with the most knowledge of the game. And what would it look like if we broke that assumption?
Here is listener Jordan's hot take.
I love the first 2 chapters of The Beauty of Games. I loved thinking of games as an aesthetic form outside of thinking of it as art. I also loved the comparison between Go and poker. In the end, it really fell flat for me, especially what he says about game theory. He says that maybe, just maybe, a field of knowledge that came out of a close analysis of poker saved the world. And he doesn't really expound on that. He doesn't really provide evidence for that. Whereas I had recently listened to an interview with Kelly Clancy, who's a neuroscientist and the author of Playing with Reality, in which she says game theory's power lies in its expressiveness. It can convey dynamic stories with simple mechanics. Unfortunately, game theory has been used to launder dubious beliefs and present racist, nativist policies as objective or inevitable. Some of these sinister fables have been taken out of context and integrated into the foundations of accepted common sense. And I wish that Frank Lantz had done more to back up his opinion on game theory as a counterpoint to that, but he just really doesn't. If you're going to continue the book club series, and I really hope that you do, I hope that you'll include Kelly Clancy's book, Playing with Reality, How Games Have Shaped Our World. I think it's really great. From what I've read so far, I haven't finished it. I love your podcast. Thank you so much.
Jordan spittin'.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan.
Yeah, I think we've talked about a lot of what he was getting at the end already, but I do think that there is a really interesting point at the beginning about the way that Frank structures his argument and the language that he uses, because he's very careful not to use the term art, which I think is totally reasonable. And I think
he spends 40 pages talking about how he's not going to use the term art, and it's like, okay, just
sure,
don't use it then.
But no, I mean, I feel like that's something that I often try and also do deliberately. If a term has too much baggage, an example I've used a couple times before is talking about aggro in cubes, where when I was designing regular cube for the first time, people were like, what are you talking about aggro? There's no aggro deck here. You can't have 13 copies of Savannah Lions, so this isn't aggro. And I'm like, okay, well, that term is completely bogging us down. We're not having a reasonable conversation because you're just hung up on what that term means to you. I'm just going to pick a different word and talk about the most proactive deck or the fastest deck, because what I really wanted to get at was how does, the fastest deck in the format sort of shape the metagame? And I think he's doing the same thing. He's obviously saying games are art. That is the thesis here. But there's so much baggage associated with the term art that he's just reaching for terms that are more descriptive, and I think actually just help us have a more reasonable argument about it.
No, actually, I totally agree with his whole stance there. I just felt it was really drawn out and repetitive. Maybe that's because it was not for me, because I agree with it so immediately, and some people need to be convinced, but...
Yeah. Just to speak a little more on the John von Neumann game theory, poker saving the world thing. Game theory was invented by the mathematician John von Neumann, who was a Manhattan Project scientist, and was so bad at poker that he decided, he was losing money left and right in the, nightly Los Alamos poker drafts or whatever. It's not a draft, but I'm so
I like
cute.
To draft.
I'll take the ace.
All the aces.
He was so bad at it that he decided to use math to help him improve, and kind of accidentally invented this thing called the minimax theorem, which is a way of describing how to achieve an optimum. In other words, it's a very optimization-focused mathematical theorem, happens to be broadly applicable, and so he accidentally invented game theory. And this went on to be used in a lot of fields, most notably economics, which is where you get some of those really racist or nativist assumptions. And that is exactly, I think, the point of you can't over-apply the system. Systemic thinking or systems thinking gets you far, but you have to recognize when the system is leading you down a path that's not ethical or not morally correct or whatever.
Yeah, I agree with Jordan, though. I don't think he touched on that almost at all in this book.
I agree. But we actually have never mentioned, or we hadn't told the listeners why the poker thing was bothersome.
Yeah.
Okay.
And actually, Princeton, I think, put out a video series where you could just essentially audit their intro to game theory class.
Yeah.
And watch a series of 50-minute lectures by this one professor about game theory. And I watched 2/3 of the entire course worth, because I find game theory very fascinating, and it is something that I think is important to how I think about the world, and important in a sense that I'm also very critical of its application, right? I think it is a powerful thought technology that has essentially been abused by free market capitalism to do whatever they see fit, and used by powers without, people's best interest in mind.
Right.
So, yeah, I agree completely with Jordan here, and I'm actually interested to read the book that Jordan referenced, and he also sent a YouTube link, which I'll put in the comments here, which is from the interview he was referencing in his comments. So, should we hit up DSB, or you want to hit some of these Zoid Draft?
Let's hit Zoid Draft.
Hey, this is Steven, also known as Zoid Draft in Cube Spaces. The beauty of games was uneven. The first chapter especially, he's really just revealing his own inability to imagine how other people think. He comes up with these counter arguments or alternate viewpoints that no one would ever actually take on. And it really just makes his own positions, which are pretty mundane, seem just very thin, because he can't even defend them against a coherent counter argument. The second chapter was a lot better. The writing about poker, and especially Go, was actually, I thought it was pretty moving. The passion that he has for those games and his way of articulating how much they mean and how much they can teach you, I found inspiring, and it made me want to play those games more. So I thought he did a great job of that. His thesis about games teaching systems literacy I thought was really interesting. And I can see certain kinds of games doing that for certain people. And I think someone else could develop those ideas a lot further. I don't think they work as a unified theory of the beauty of games, though. He has a problem throughout the entire book where he's so focused on games that are about thinking that he completely leaves off the table sports, where a big part of it is physical performance. And that's also true of Twitch shooters or whatever else, where the actual execution beyond just making the plan is an important part of the game. And so as much as systems literacy could be built by certain kinds of games, there's just so many other games where that's not really what you're taking away from them. The highlight of my reading experience was playing his game Universal Paperclips while I was reading the book. So many of the same ideas that he's talking about and concepts that he's interested in come through in the game at the same time, and they're a lot more compelling when you're interacting with them and seeing them play out within that virtual space. I think that's a little bit damning for his book that playing the game gets the ideas across better, but it does vindicate the ideas somewhat. And I think at the end of the day, like, he is a game designer, and he is a better game designer than he is a writer. So if you are at this point to pick up this book, or maybe you're not going to ever pick up the book, playing the game is probably actually worth your time. It's a few hours, and it's got some interesting ideas, especially for a game where a number is going up. The one thing I really wanted him to talk more about was he brings up data-driven game design, and he says something vaguely disparaging about it, and I would love to hear him talk more about that, because he worked at Zynga, which made all those Facebook games like Farmville and stuff, and I feel like he probably has such incredible experiences with that, and this book was not the place for them, but I want those stories.
Yeah, I mean, he said it was sort of damning that the game was more compelling than the book, but I feel like that's just highlighting a lot of Frank's points, is that like games can be really compelling and both teach you about systems and create an aesthetic experience that allows that sort of development of systems thinking. So I feel like that's working for me.
Yeah. I love Universal Paperclips and had played it before reading this book and thought it was a fantastic game. Have you played it, Parker?
No.
I think you definitely should. I think you'll really enjoy it. It does take, I don't know, I mean, a couple hours, maybe, and you can pick it up and put it down, but I think it's worth just setting time aside and doing it in one shot. I don't want to spoil it for people who haven't played it. It's a game about making paperclips that's just basically text-based in a browser.
Yeah, it's online. Google it.
Yeah, so just go play it, because there's also some unfolding fun there that you would not expect from the abstract description of the game. I did not know he worked at Zynga, and that to me is a huge detractor. Huge check in the, hey, maybe, I don't know.
Look, we all got to have day jobs.
Yeah, but to me, like, the company may be among the most responsible for churning out the thinnest, shallowest slot machine games.
Yeah, somebody's got to make the 90%.
Yeah, well, I mean, line your pockets doing that and then write a book about how beautiful and awesome games are.
I want to respond to a different point, which is the one about sports not really falling under this definition. And I might buy that argument, but let's think about how sports could be systems thinking. So, the player isn't thinking about how to throw a football in the terms of like the system of their body or whatever, but the coach is thinking about a system of like, how do I optimize my players' positions or, tactics or whatever to achieve the best outcomes against the opponent who's also trying to optimize. And so that's a systemic thing. People who observe sports and are watching like the draft of the players are thinking about systems of like, how does my team optimize their salary cap or whatever with the quality of the players and their draft picks and their possible trades. So I do think, there's some systems thinking to it.
I have a just wildly unfounded gut intuition about this I want to share, which I've played sports like completely recreationally growing up and never at any competitive level. My impression of coaching or being the like offensive coordinator for a team or like the positions in sports that would otherwise could be described as like systems thinking jobs is that they're actually very minimally about that and a lot more about like leadership and like figuring out how to motivate a bunch of people that have different complex human needs to like have a shared goal. And like, it's not about figuring out like, okay, where do I put my tight end who has X and Y stats and what plays do I run against their defense? I don't actually think it's that. I think it's like recognizing the complex humanity in each of your players and figuring out how to get the best out of them in a like much messier way that, sure, ultimately in the way that like we're all just electrons bouncing around a sack of meat could maybe be described as a system.
Mostly protons and neutrons.
Get wrecked.
Could maybe be aspirationally described as a system, but I think is actually much fuzzier. Like Bill Belichick, probably the greatest coach of all time by a lot of people's, reckoning. I would be surprised to find out that Bill Belichick is like a brilliant systems thinker and could like, play chess really well. I think he could very likely be a fantastic CEO of a company before he'd be a really good Magic player, is my completely unfounded intuition around sports and what it means to be like a leader in sports.
Yeah. So I'm hearing that you watched Remember the Titans and I watched Moneyball, and we're coming at it from those perspectives.
I watched neither of those things.
I mean, me neither, but
I just have a lot of sympathy. I feel like it's really easy to look at a work and say, well, they didn't talk about XYZ. How could they have made this tremendous omission? And it's like, well, you can't write about everything all the time.
He spent 40 pages talking about how he wasn't going to use the word art. There was room.
After doing a podcast for so many years, I have so much sympathy for understanding that not everything can be in every episode.
I agree with you, but also that shines a like starker light on the things you did choose to include. You chose to include Nate Silver as a great example of gamer knowledge. You chose to rebut your cursory mention of all of the very valid criticisms of your idea with the fact that you figured out how knots form in your pocket, right? Like
sliding into second person podcasting here.
If that's
Frank.
If that's what you choose to include, then I think it is very valid to say like, why that and not this, right? Why that and not reasonable criticisms of how game theory is actually used in practice, and reasonable criticisms of all the awful games Zynga made and their impact on people. I don't think Zynga made games that ever made people think in this like deeper, profound way that Frank describes games.
Man, Zynga games look so high quality now compared to what's happening on the internet. Have you even like been in the Nintendo eStore? The amount of garbage in there is just insane.
Let's not.
All right, let's hear what DSB has to say about the beauty of games.
Well, the last thing I wanted to say about these comments is that I totally agree. Actually, I thought that honestly the highlight of this book for me probably was Frank's beautiful descriptions of what games mean to him. And if this book was called What Games Mean to Me, and was his descriptions of Serpentes and Go and Poker and Quap, I'd be like, that's a great little series of essays around, and you could then form your own conclusions about like what that could mean more broadly. The like very ambitious reaching is just where it lost me, and it sounds like a couple of our listeners as well. All right, closing on the man, the myth, the legend, DSB.
DSB here. And my review of The Beauty of Games by Frank Lantz. The Beauty of Games reads like a half-remembered wine bottle label. It's a series of obvious ideas and sentiments glued together with fake emotions in an attempt to sound important. The writing feels like Lantz wrote about 10 actual pages and then handed it to a ghostwriter to balloon into 100 pages. Then that person either quit or was so depressed they handed it to another ghostwriter and added another 64 pages. The result is a book that is too washed out in general for anyone who actually plays games. The target audience is some middle manager without a modicum of personality looking to make small talk around the coffee pot with some Gen Z freelancers. The Beauty of Games reads like how you would imagine that conversation going. A painful and embarrassing regurgitation of factoids peppered with non-committal opinions. But let's attempt to look past these glaring surface flaws and dissect the arguments made. In the first 100 pages, Lantz tries to say, games can be viewed as an aesthetic experience, which is about as interesting as the is sushi a burrito debate. The additions of quotes and references pulled wholesale from better authors and thinkers are the best parts of this first stack of paper. There is a small moment when Lantz talks about poker and Go, which are probably the only real thing he wrote, wherein you can sense some actual opinions and emotions, but then the remaining pages devolve back into generalizations. The writing brushes against some philosophical ideas regarding aesthetics, the Enlightenment, there's a few words about colonialism, and at one point almost says something about information and entropy, but all of these come across as the la croix of their real substance, just hints that read and are remembered like taglines of NPR stories. They give the middle manager the ability to nod along as the third wheel in a conversation about Settlers of Catan, but not really add to the discourse. So, yeah, I didn't like it. It felt written to fill some capitalistic model of, quote, a book about games. It's just a hollow, phoned-in, ghost-written book, created because of some calculated metric that said this topic will sell X many copies. The best part of the book is by far the sources that it pulls from, so just go read those. And also, I just wanted to say I really enjoyed hating this book and would love to do more book club stuff like this. And I think we should probably read Playing Oppression next. Thank you, LPR, and everybody else that has contributed to this. It is a great honor and privilege being a part of this community.
Oh, my God. I mean, none of us had listened to that prior to this. Yeah, I mean, first of all, there's a man that is not at all worried about who's listening to his podcast. So let's just start there. I really appreciate DSB's candor. And I mean, I think it's evident that I agree pretty much completely. I'm not sure I would say it in those words, but I completely agree. And
I don't think you could say it in those words.
I'm not as capable of that, surely. But honestly, comparing like the whole first chapter of this book to Is Sushi a Burrito? That's exactly what it felt like to me the whole time. And the whole time I'm like, yeah, sushi's not a burrito. It's fine. Just move on. And he didn't. He just kept talking about whether sushi was a burrito or not. Constantly. Any rebuttal from two people that liked the book?
I guess I have to go read all these other books now.
I do really agree with what DSP said of like the sources that this book uses.
I didn't even notice that two of the things I referenced were sources, not the actual book itself.
Yeah, I mean, we've got CT Win, we've got Donella Meadows and that whole systems thinking project. We've got, as DSP mentioned, Playing Oppression. Those would all be really like excellent places to extend one's study. If you read Beauty of Games and found it a little lacking or wanted to go deeper, those would be great places.
I gotta be honest, I thought this book was going to be like a layup because multiple people have recommended it to us, and it seems like it's so in line with what the show is. I thought it would just be like a conversation about how we all like the book, and I really didn't. And it also reminded me of why I actually don't read that many books. I for sure would have put this one down 15 pages in and never picked it up again. 100%. I only finished it because of this commitment to this book club, and it was a slog. I did not enjoy it.
Wow. Well, I think there's only one order of business left. What are we going to read next?
I'm down for Playing Oppression.
Do we have to decide now? We got so many good
right now.
We got so many good. I mean, Jordan recommended a different book. DSB recommended a book. There's also all the other books referenced in this book, which are also fine. I would also be totally fine. Here, honestly, what I would most like to spend this time doing, especially if you want to keep participating in this with us, Parker, is like a book that one of us has read and enjoys.
Okay, well, you're already in the middle of Nosedive, right, Parker? So.
Yes.
I mean, I would be so down to talk about Nosedive.
You would not get through Nosedive.
I'm not sure. I read all of the pattern language and delighted in it, and could not make it
a pattern language.
Could not make it through this book happily. So, a pattern language is 8 times as long and in many ways way more dry. I don't know. I might really enjoy Nosedive. Honestly, I'd be so down to do something completely unrelated than necessarily like just jumping to the next logical conclusion from this book. Mostly because I don't want to have this experience again. I'm straight up not having a good time, and I don't want to do. I don't want to read a whole other book and then like. Hey, honestly, here's what it is. I recognize I'm very critical.
I mean, you put so many Post-it notes in that book. It barely closes.
It definitely sits a little open. I recognize I'm very critical, and I don't just want this to be. I mean, I also kind of empathize with DSB's. I enjoyed hating this book a little bit, but I don't know that that's what I want the book club to be.
Okay.
I don't know. Let's think about it. I don't want to decide right now. I want to think about it a little bit. Yeah. But I do think we can do this like quarterly, reasonably. At the very least, like twice a year is easy. I think quarterly is also reasonable. And I wouldn't hate pushing myself to read more books and actually finishing them, because I start a lot of books like this one and then put it down because I think it's drivel and never read it again. So
I kind of think we should have just ended the podcast after DSB's finished talking. It's been downhill from there.
We all agree that if DSB had a podcast, we'd all just be listening to that and not even making this one.
Great. By put out one episode, I mean there's an MP3 file that he dropped into a Discord channel. That's very difficult to find.
Are you talking about... Because he's got a couple of examples of things where he goes on YouTube and plays multiple videos simultaneously and like mixes them together,
that
like
was interesting
in like
as well.
A live cultural DJing.
Cool.
No, he sort of told a story and interspersed it with some piano.
Honestly, you know what I think it is? I feel privileged to know people like DSB in my life and other friends that are like equally as creative and beautifully minded. And this truly reads as somebody who is not actually as interesting as someone like DSB, but is desperately trying to be.
I want to say that's like a huge burn, but it's really hard to be as interesting as DSB.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a real try hard book. The book is extremely sweaty, is what it comes down to. Any final conclusions?
I did not find it as sweaty. I think
you said you wanted to seek out this man and be his postdoctoral student multiple times.
Yeah.
Do you still feel this way?
We don't have to put that on air.
No, we're airing it.
Oh, dang.
Also, like, to be clear, that's totally like, I don't see that as like a, just because I didn't love this book and don't see the world exactly as he does, like, I don't think that like reflects badly on you if you do. Like, it's great. Like,
well, I did find it really helpful to realize that somebody else is thinking about the world the way that I did, and they're not in science, and they're not making weapons.
Yeah.
And they're not working for
unless
a petrochemical
you consider Zynga
company.
games a weapon of the mind.
Yeah, maybe, but less directly a weapon than petrochemicals.
Yes,
so,
for sure.
I did find it really hopeful in that way because I kind of needed reinforcement from somebody who says, yes, systems matter, but no, it is not the only thing that matters. There are things that matter as much or more than systems thinking, which is like ethics and this meta rationality.
I guess it's funny. It's not what I got out of this book at all. But like I said, we each bring different things to the table. So
yeah,
I think we'd all agree that if we could be a postdoctoral student under DSB, we would do it in a heartbeat.
Oh, for sure.
I think the work would be hard.
Oh yeah,
I think
good, but good, meaningful,
a lot of
hard
field work.
Yeah, for sure.
There'd be some.
You'd be out in the woods,
mayonnaise
dropping
sandwiches.
geocaches. You'd be, who knows what you'd be eating?
3D printing things.
Ham in a bathroom, all kinds of stuff.
Ham.
All right, we got to wrap it up there. We've gone on quite long. Do let us know in the comments, whether you're on YouTube, Spotify, on the Discord, in the Reddit. Let us know if this episode was good. We saw a lot of people reading the book, and then I actually, to be honest, there was a whole thread in the MTG Cube Talk Discord I just didn't read before this episode because I didn't want to be impacted by other people's thoughts. I'm going to go read that now and see what other people thought of this book. But yeah, let us know if this was fun. And I think we're going to do it again regardless, even if you don't think it's fun. But maybe that'll affect how often we do it or what kinds of things we cover, depending on how people thought about it. And on that bombshell, that's the end of this episode of Lucky Paper Radio. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This podcast is produced by thinking really hard about this book, The Beauty of Games by Frank Lantz, and then speaking to a microphone about it. If we got anything wrong about any cards in this episode that was on purpose for engagement bait, Anthony and Parker, thank you for the gift of friendship and the gift of Cube.
Thank you for reading a book with me. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the beauty of games, but like the real kind, not the book, but I mean the beauty that we created together playing games.
All right, let's do this thing. How's that sound?
Good. Podcast.
Yeah.
Energy.
Good?
Morning energy. Everybody
I
have
like
coffee?
how you have to get so psyched up to record. You're like, I feel like you're like a boxer in the corner. You're like loosening up. You're like spraying water in your eyes. You're like,
That's how I felt. That's how I felt at Steel City Cube going into my one potential 3-0. I was just like, all right, gotta shake it out.
I mean, it worked. You
get
got
cool.
there.
It worked.
Yeah.
It worked.
Did not get to the top 8.
Trophy champion of
made
Baltimore.
a liar of me.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny how badly
my
I really wanted a pin. I really wanted a pin pretty bad.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't feel good about the fact that I'm like, oh, I'm having so much more fun now that I've won one.
I mean, look,
it really
winning
does
is
make
definitely
a difference.
fun. It makes a big difference.
Winning is fun.
Yeah, it turns out.